Welcome back. Our topic today is still death. It is worth noting that death in the context of our topic today is not just the extinction of life in a general physical sense. We can regard it as an extension of the topic of death. Where to extend it to? Today, we will extend it to the field of photography. There is no doubt that the topic of death is always attached to something that is widely discussed in the field of philosophy. Philosophical works such as Heidegger's Being and Time and Husserl's Phenomenology are essential references that must be acknowledged and engaged with when exploring the topic of death through various theoretical perspectives. Philosophical masters. So what is the connection between these and the field of photography? Could it be that these topics that relate to the topic of death, these significant philosophical thoughts, will also have a subtle connection with photography, even though it seems to have nothing to do with it? Here we have to mention a person, a Frenchman named Bernard Stiegler, a philosopher that you may not be very familiar with. In this regard, I also think it is very necessary to review the life and experience of this philosopher. This will be very helpful for us to understand his philosophical theory and understand its usefulness in discussing our topic today. Bernard Stiegler's personal life is quite legendary. The legendary part is that Bernard is a criminal. He was deliberately committed 4 crimes. The crime was robbery, and the target of the robbery was the bank. He has also explained the crimes he committed, but the reasons may be a little difficult to understand for us who are used to putting emotions in the acts of people. He claimed that he, who was born in the middle class, had actually gotten rid of the shackles called money. After dropping out of college, he brought a restaurant and a jazz bar, accompanied by his social skills. Well, in the era he lived in, places like bars were usually mixed. In Stiegler's own words, there were often some unruly hooligans among the customers. Once, a policeman forced him to identify one of his customers, and he refused, which led to the closure of his bar. Yeah, for this reason, he realized the contradictions in the rules, and then he set off his idea of robbing the bank, with the purpose of getting back the money he deposited in the bank in a way that broke the rules. Yeah, needless to say, he was put in prison. It was precisely because of this incomprehensible impulse, his rebellion against the rules and his ability to perceive contradictions, that he inexplicably developed an interest in philosophy in the prison. And the master of phenomenology in the field of philosophy became his mentor. Perhaps Derrida saw that Stiegler possessed a valuable quality, which was emphasized by his mastery in his phenomenology, an ability to break away from the cognition of life and experience for the self, to isolate the common sense of self-evident in daily life and construct a suspended situation distinct from scientific theory. Just from some perspectives, if we are willing to spend some time after the show to look through the papers or notes of scholars in various fields related to Stiegler, we will find that, in the eyes of most scholars, the philosophical thoughts of this French philosopher are closer to a single theory, that is, closer to explaining the essence of a single thing, rather than talking about or retelling the structure of a whole universe. One of the implications is that Bernard Stiegler is still in the category of darkness in the eyes of many scholars, even though the master Derrida accepted him as his first disciple. The reason is that Stiegler still practices his attitude of defying rules in his own research and in his own philosophical thought. Without rigorous philosophical training, his logical sequence usually presents an organized format, and a scattered romance and sensibility are filled in the text that should be governed by reason. This is what the academic community criticized him for. In a simple sentence, it is more like a theory of analyzing art and literature, rather than a philosophical thought. Therefore, we will also find that many theories in the field of art today will draw nourishment from his thoughts. His most famous work, Technology and Time, has become the most commonly noted or taken theoretical source for art after entering the 21st century, especially in photography and film art, including various critiques. In Stigler's Technique and Time, he talked about the concept about photography. This concept is actually closely related to the topic of death. Here we must throw out a premise for the following content. As Stigler said in words, his entry point as well as the theory point of our topic today will be based on the theories of Roland Barthes and Husserl, or most accurately, as an annotation of them. To begin with, we must first grasp the concept of persistence. At its core, persistence refers to something that is retained over time. What is retained, however, is not static. It carries within it a range of unknown possibilities embedded in casual relationships. These possibilities are commonly experienced as expectations, but in philosophical terms, they can be understood as forming a node of pre-storage pool. There exists a complex layered relationship between what is stored and what is pre-stored, one that is not easily untangled. Together, these processes form the basis of attention. From the standpoint of pre-storage, if we examine this through a logical lens, we can identify two forms of persistence, the first dimension and the second dimension. These dimensions reveal how layered expectations and stored experience interact to shape perception and thought. The first dimension represents and forms the present, and the second dimension exists in the past that has passed away. To put it simply, the first dimension is perception, the second dimension is memory, and perception constitutes the present, making the present able to be grasped by us and become the first dimension that we can hold in our perception. But when time passes, this present has passed, and the first dimension with perception values will be transferred to the second dimension, and it will definitely be disturbed. What we need to pay attention to is the passage of time we are talking about. That is, disappearance of the first dimension. It is not grand, nor describes the past in years or months. The past we're talking about is quite delicate. It will be calculated in minutes or seconds, just like in this video. You're listening to my video, perception. While the first dimension is constructing the present that belongs to you, the second dimension also appears frequently, immediately following the first dimension, becoming a memory that we can understand and deploy when needed. Its degree of detail can be said to be that the process of existence and disappearance is almost superimposed and operated together, almost in complete unity. The interesting thing is that the situation constructed by the first dimension and its transformation towards the second dimension will show differences in cognition due to the differences in our own perception and senses. For example, after listening to the above content, some viewers think that the theories I said are all fabricated, which is the manifestation of his personal perception difference. At least when the first dimension is constructing the situation that is moving towards the second dimension, some inducement approached his attention. Attention became scattered, so that the second dimension, which belongs entirely to it, directly ignores these theories, which are not proposed by me, but by Husserl's phenomenology, which is the presupposed text. This is the kind of death emphasizing today's topic. When you hear my words, when the sounds enter your brain, the first dimension has died. The second dimension then appears to form your cognition of the sentence. This is not only true for the perceptual thinking under sensory data, but also for the thinking mastered by the text. However, when talking about text, we will face multiple complex theories due to the intertextual letters and other contents. Therefore, we will not elaborate on it here today. But now, let's look at the photo. The person in the photo is the philosopher Husserl, who we just mentioned about. If we think about this photo with Husserl's own phenomenological theory just discussed, we will find that things like photos actually presuppose a kind of existence, that is, the existence of death. If we don't talk about whether the protagonist person or fabric in the photo has disappeared in the real world, we will come to the conclusion that he has disappeared in the first dimension. This is often contrary to our feelings when viewing traditional works of art. The painting that appears in front of you now must be very familiar to everyone. The Mona Lisa, a work by Leonardo da Vinci. When we gaze at this work, we will find that compared with photos, disappearance of the first dimension does not seem to be as obvious as gazing at photos. This is because paintings emphasize other factors besides attention. That is, they require us to use our imagination based on personal views or taste to help spread attention. From this perspective, it has a more harmonious compatibility with the first dimension under perception. Well, the reason why imagination is involved is that painting tells us the existence it depicts in its own language. For example, the work of Mona Lisa will inevitably have omissions. Artists changes and artificially enlarged or reduce certain features of a certain existence. Therefore, it will use text to describe the differences between paintings and photographies. One is more like poetry and fiction. The other is more like theoretical, in-depth, fact-based paper and restoration from death itself. In this regard, we can even find traces of sentiments, that is, temperaments between photographers and painting artists. The difference is, it seems, that painting artists are usually more emotional, like poets who are sentimental or even have a bad temper, generally more emotional, while photographers are more rational, just like many philosophers who love photography. At this point, many listeners must have discovered the reason why paintings are more emotional than photography is because they rely on our first dimension, the present, that is firmly controlled by perception and belongs to us. The photography disappears in the first dimension. Our second dimension begins to play a role. Then it returns to the first dimension again, disappears again, returns again, and so on and so forth. This is painting. The dimension brought by the paintings belong to the present and the past of each self, and it emphasizes the present more. That is, it emphasizes the first dimension more. Photography is different. It emphasizes the dimension of the present that once existed on the photo, not the dimension of you or me right now. Therefore, photography shows a unique kind of death, that is, describing a state that does not exist in our present or once existed in our present. We will assume that it has disappeared, yet the photo constantly brings us back to the first dimension, then to the second dimension, which is constantly dying and returning, stuck in a loop between the first dimension and the second dimension. In plain words, paintings emphasize the sensual present that we perceive when we watch the work, and then let it disappear in our own present. Photography emphasizes the present that it restores on the photo. The first dimension and the second dimension constantly disappears in the wealth of on the photo. This state of endless cycle, constant death and return, is called the third dimension by Stigler. In essence, the third dimension refers to continual return, a return to the reconstructive potential of existence as it reactivated. As Stigler wrote, the past is reproduced without reservation and without error, like a present that once existed. Yet, what is reproduced is not the past itself, but a kind of spectral presence, a spirit or ghost participating in the present. For me, Photographies are the present in past tense. Even if the past the capture is not mine, even if that is I never lived, it remains a past that truly existed. The light captured in a photo is like the starlight that reaches us from an indefinitely distant past. It links my present to a time I've never experienced. It feels as intimate as my experience itself. Light becomes a gentle, nourishing layer in the long night of a time, a medium through which the possibility of rebirth in present emerges. Thus, we must say that when a photography does not look like, it remains merely a relic of enlightenment, waiting to be awakened by the gaze that brings it back into being. When it is looked at by others, a voice of my heart emerges. Regardless of whether we are present in a moment depicted in a photo, the process of death, of rebirth is revealed. Stigler's theory of the third dimension of existence has become a widely discussed and applied thought in the field of art in the 21st century. Of course, many scholars have also pointed out many defects in his theory. One of the points that has been criticized the most by scholars is discussion on presence. Scholars point out that when gazing at a photo, if we are not present at a moment restored by the photo, we cannot perceive a third dimension of existence that is dead and reborn. Under such premise, the third dimension of existence will not exist. That is to say, when we look at a photography with no memory, we linger outside the present moment depicted in a photography, just like looking at a classical painting from the outside instead of being in it. This debate has been going on almost all around the background of Stigler's third dimension theory. However, the latest science in the 21st century has resolved this dispute. With the in-depth study of neuroscience, psychology, and human brain, constructivist scholar and a group of scientists have found that people will constantly tamper with their memories. That is, constantly tamper with the existence of self in the second dimension. Wow, when we look at an old photo, especially a photo about ourselves, we may mistakenly think that we were present at the time when we were not there at all. The more subtle thing is that when we look at a photo that is completely unrelated to ourselves, what we associate with is also memory-related content, all because we presume or modern technology helps us presuppose that a photo must be real and carry existence from the past. This is tantamount to confirming Stigler's technological theory of the third dimension. Or it should be said that he revisited Stigler's third dimension of theory. That is, when we gaze at a photo, we're actually overlapping our own present existence with the present existence restored in the photo. When we gaze at a photograph, we evoke more memories than the imagination we have when gaze at a painting. When we gaze at a photograph, we project the present moment of our own existence across space and time into the present moment restored by the photograph, forming the third dimension described by Stigler, that is, a state of constant death and constant return. Well, here we'll describe the state of constant death and constant return as the sensibility under the gaze of death. This description has a hint of madness, because this statement is leading to the position of rationality and sensibility, recognizing rationality as sensibility and sensibility as rationality. The interesting thing is that when we gaze at a photo, we are doing exactly this, constantly comparing rationality and sensibility. It is like facing a broken mirror without reservation, and the self has long been torn into pieces without realization. Therefore, when we take out a photo and gaze at it coldly alone, a unique emotion will appear, because that emotion not only belongs to ourselves, but also to the present moment of the person in the photo, and to everyone who projects their self onto him through their own memory. So when we gaze at a photo, we discover a kind of existence that is conceived and born through death. Okay, let's stop here for today's topic. Thank you for listening and watching, and see you next time.